So picking up where we last started, or picking off from where we last left off, let's talk about cost plus and price cap regulation. So cost plus regulation is used by some regulators in some instances to essentially, the regulators permit a certain amount of profit above the costs needed to provide the good or service. So we know that part of the issue with these oligopolies and natural monopolies is the fact that they can just charge people whatever they want. So the government has a couple of different ways. It can say cost plus. It can say you can only make, a 20% level of profit above what you pay for costs. Now, what's the problem with cost plus regulation? It's not easy, but it's not impossible. And we have seen instances of it where people will, they could vertically integrate, and they could buy the person who is supplying them with stuff, and then they could jack up the costs, right, as a way to increase the price or increase the profits or whatever the case may be. So there's a way to pad costs such that cost plus regulation is not ideal. So again, with almost all of this stuff in economics, there's pros and cons, right? There's drawbacks and there's benefits to these different things. With regards to price cap regulation, this is when the regulators actually control and come in and set a price that the firm cannot exceed over the next few years. So moving on, let's talk about period in the United States political economy history, the Great Deregulation Experiment. So if regulation is creating controls over prices and quantities, then deregulation is then the removing of the government controls over prices and quantity. And part of the drive for this great deregulation experiment is due to a phenomenon known as regulatory capture. If there was probably one thing in economics that a lot of people talk about but don't actually know the name or the technical definition of, it would probably be regulatory capture. I have a lot of lay people, when I tell them I'm an economist or whatever, they'll, go into some rant or whatever, and essentially they'll be talking about regulatory capture, right? So this is the phenomenon of when the supposedly regulated firms end up playing a large role in setting the regulations that they will follow. So why is this called regulatory capture? Because as a result of this, these firms capture the politicians or bureaucrats How do they capture them? They usually do this with a promise of a job or a seat on the board of the company, right? Once their term in the government has ended. So these politicians or bureaucrats are captured by the entities upon which they are trying to regulate, to create regulations. Does that make sense, everyone? So because of the fact that regulatory capture is such a big thing, there's been a big drive. There was a big drive, at least up until the 2008, 2006, 2008 great financial crisis. There was a big drive to deregulate. However, what happened in 2006, 2008? So many people, economists, political science, will say that a big reason why 2006, 2008 was such a bad recession, was such a bad financial catastrophe for the world, was because of the lack of regulation, right? The lack of disclosure of information, and so on and so forth. So, as a result of that, right, we had the 2006, 2008 financial crisis. And then after the 2006, 2008 financial crisis, we had some new regulatory acts introduced. The first one we'll talk about briefly is the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. So this was designed to increase confidence in the financial information provided by public corporations. Why was this done? It was done to protect investors from accounting fraud. In fact, I actually think this was a result of Enron. Yep, it was in 2002. Yep, and it was absolutely, yep, this 2002. So there was a deregulation. This happened in 2002 after the Enron collapse. Which is a whole lecture in and of itself, talking about Enron collapse and the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. The Dodd-Frank Act absolutely was created as a response to the great financial crisis. Let me just get a little bit extra here. Boop. Yep, 2010. So this act was, all of these things were trying to promote financial stability, right? But this specifically was trying to promote financial stability by improving accountability and transparency in the financial system writ large, to end the whole too big to fail thing. Exactly. While there was still a lot of their debt on the Treasury Secretary's balance sheet at 100%. To protect Americans, taxpayers, by ending bailouts and to protect consumers from abusive financial services practices. And there were abusive financial service practices. They were charging people outlandish rates on credit cards and so on and so forth. They were charging people really high fees, really high yearly fees or whatever the case may be. They were also just doing stuff that was straight up illegal. So there was an investigation into Wells Fargo, and it turns out it was coming from the top, and everybody was in on it. They had this internal mnemonic catchphrase about how 8 is great. And they were referring to the number of accounts that every Wells Fargo person should have. You should open 8 accounts for all your clients. Don't let them know. Open these 8 accounts and we get all the fees for them. But they were literally just opening accounts to charge extra fees and to pad their numbers. And they got caught red-handed by the government and slapped on the wrist or whatever. It's not as if there were no abusive financial service practices. We literally had a agency that was just the Consumer Protection Agency, right? The Consumer Financial Protection Agency that was just to essentially address violations of the Dodd-Frank Act. All right. The book has a nice little part about airline deregulation, but just to save ourselves the hand cramping, we will not go through that timeline, but please read that part. So read about airline deregulation. Please. It's one of the questions on the chapter test. Okay. So I'll take any questions about this, I guess, today or on Wednesday.